Hello, and welcome to Lesson 1, Government Debate. Now, before we get into the mechanics of government, we first have to explore what is government? What does government do? At least in its simplest form. First of all, the definition of government. The word itself comes from ancient Greece. It comes from two different sources. The first is gouverner, which means to steer, and the second is gubernaculum, which means rudder, essentially to steer the rudder of state. Now, what is government itself? Well, it is legitimate and exclusive use of force. It is an organization where policies are enforced as well as determining that policy. And finally, a definition of government is to seek the welfare of the citizens and fulfill their need for the betterment of the state. These are the best definitions that we can give for the idea of government. Government itself also deals with the idea that we will explore this semester of national sovereignty. Now, what is national sovereignty? Well, national sovereignty is a political entity, a nation, or a country that is externally recognized to exercise the final authority over its own affairs. Usually, we are referring to a national government. National governments have the right to govern their people as it wishes, without interference from outside forces. So, for example, the United States of America is a national government. It governs its people based on its own design, the U.S. Constitution, and it does so without interference from outside forces, aka other countries. If you look at a state, the state of Texas. The state of Texas is not a national government. It is a state government. It does have some right to govern its people based on its own design, the state of Texas Constitution, but it does not do so without the interference of outside forces. The main outside force that interferes in the state of Texas is the national government, the federal government, the United States government. And that is because Texas does not have national sovereignty. Now, what are the purposes of a government? Well, the first purpose is to maintain order. A government must establish the rule of law. That way they can preserve life and protect people's property. The second purpose of government is to provide public goods. These are benefits and services that are available to everyone in society. The third purpose of government is to promote equality. This is to promote policies to work for the betterment of society. Now, the concepts of government. First of all, there is a dispute about the idea of freedom. There are two types of freedom: freedom of and freedom from. When you look at freedom of, the definition is absence of constraints on behavior. That means you have the freedom to do something. An example of this is in the United States Constitution, where the Constitution gives you freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religious expression. These are outlined rights or freedoms that you are guaranteed. Now, freedom from is a completely different concept. Freedom from is essentially the immunity from fear and want, a fight against exploitation and oppression. So If you are granted the freedom of, that means you have the freedom of speech. But freedom from is designed to protect you from something. Another concept of government is order. Order is designed to preserve life and protect property. This is probably the most agreed upon concept of the idea of government. Now, those on the right, the more conservative wing of philosophy, would say that when you're talking about order, you're also talking about preserving social order. And many will argue that morals and ethics are something that government should protect, while others will say that that is not a legitimate function of government, that government should not be, and we're not talking about crime morals, we're talking about religious morals or things of that nature. Now, when we look at this idea of social order, what is social order? Well, social order is when norms are enforced on behavior, things that should be outside the realm of government. An example of preserving the social order would be blue laws. Many states had these ideas where they could enact social reform in order to prevent people from doing something that the state considered to be unethical or immoral. And a good example of this in the state of Texas is drinking. There are still dry counties in the state of Texas where you cannot purchase alcohol. And yet in the states that you, or in the counties that you can purchase alcohol, many of them you cannot purchase alcohol after 12 o'clock a.m. Sunday morning. And you cannot purchase it until afternoon that same day. So there's a 12-hour period where you cannot purchase liquor. And the argument is because it is on Sunday. And Sunday is, of course, the day that Christians go to church. So in many ways, the state of Texas does impose a preservation of the social order. Some argue, if you're a more conservative person, you would argue that that is part of preserving the order of society. If you are maybe more on the liberal side, you would say that that is not a legitimate function of government. Government should not be getting involved in that kind of issue. Another concept of government that is again in debate is the idea of equality. Now, what is equality? Well, most people agree on the idea of political equality, where each citizen has one voice or a vote. Where we disagree is usually what we refer to as social equality. Social equality, when we look at it, is essentially equality in wealth, education, and status. Many people would argue. Now, when we looked at the last slide, you're probably saying to yourself, well, these seem to overlap. So where does one freedom end and another freedom begin? Are there any limitations on freedom? Well, this depends on your viewpoint of freedom. First of all, if you look at freedom versus order, the question is, how much freedom does one have to surrender to a government for its protection? This was the original dilemma of the founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin himself said something along the lines of, that freedom is only free until you start giving up protections to feel secure. That's not the direct quote, but that is essentially the thought behind his thinking, is that how much freedom would you give up in order to feel secure, to feel protected? And this is a philosophical debate. And when you talk about people, I think almost everybody you talk to philosophically would say that they would prefer freedom over order, that they would prefer to have as many freedoms as they can in order to live their daily life. But when it gets into the practical part of it, it's a little more complex. Everyone says they want as many freedoms as they can until you start asking them, well, what about your neighbor? Should your neighbor have these same protections if they interfere in your daily life? And that answer is just a little bit more difficult. Now, the second area is when we look at freedom versus equality. Most people, again, agree that, that these are two very important concepts. Popular opinion usually says that equality is very, very desirable, especially when compared with freedom. However, when you look at freedom versus equality, they do clash. And if freedom versus order was the original dilemma of the United States, freedom versus equality is the modern dilemma. Now, some of you might say, well, why is it important for us to talk equality? Well, this country was founded basically on inequality. As a white man in 1789, you had all the power, and essentially no one else did. And when I say white man, I mean a white man of means, someone who owns property. Now, we're going to talk about the founding of the government later on this term. We're going to go in detail. But just to give you a quick background, prior to the 1820s, in order to vote or hold public office in the United States, you had to own property. And the theory was essentially you had to have some kind of skin in the game. So only white men with property. Now, in the early 1800s, 1805, 1806, it began to become practice where education, a college degree of some kind, or some kind of other training would fill the gap missing from personal property. But it wasn't until the 1820s with Jacksonian democracy that all white men were given the right to vote. Now, in the era after the American Civil War, black men were given the right to vote, theoretically, but because of laws in the South that sought to strip away voting rights, many black men were not able to actually vote from 1867, 1870, all the way through the 1960s. White women were granted the right to vote about 100 years ago, this month actually, when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. In the 1960s, you began to see more equality given. Black voting rights were guaranteed. You also saw the Equal Pay Act, which required employers to pay people the same rate for equal work. In the 1970s, you saw education equality, where courts required busing of children to create a fair distribution of demographics. Prior to this, inner city schools were primarily black. Suburban schools were primarily white. Now, because of busing, a certain percentage of white students would be sent into the cities, and a certain percentage of black students would be sent into the suburbs. Very controversial, even to this day. In the 1980s, some states began passing laws calling on equal pay for comparable work. And in the 1990s, Congress itself will prohibit discrimination based on any kind of disability. This is the beginning of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In the 2000s, we see genetic information where someone, if you are given a genetic analysis and they say that you are at risk for future diseases, that could not be used against you to discriminate in hiring. The actual act was the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA. And then in the 2010s, the U.S. Supreme Court prohibited states from preventing same-sex marriage. So you see, every so often, the country works itself into becoming more equal. at least in the eyes of the law. And this continues. Every generation sees some kind of change that creates a more equal footing for certain people comparative to others. And we're going to discuss that in detail when we get to the ideas of civil rights and civil liberties. Political ideologies. Well, what is a political ideology? We hear that term quite a bit, but a lot of people don't really know the definition. Well, it is a consistent set of values and benefits for which the scope of the government should be run. Essentially, what is a group of people's thought process about how government should work? Well, the first type of political ideology we refer to as totalitarianism. These are people who advocate for unlimited power for the government, that the government should have the right to control all sectors of society. All resources of society should be pooled for the betterment of society. This theory is something we will refer to as National Socialism, that resources from society should be pooled for the betterment of the government and the society as a whole. And their goal is to essentially create a perfect society, a utopia. This is mainly, when you look at totalitarianism, it is an ultra right-wing philosophy. Now, on the left, on the ultra left side of the political ideologies, we have what's called socialism. Socialism is where a central government plays a role in regulating industry and control over the economy. In this case, resources of society are pooled for the betterment of the people. Now, there are realms of socialism. In this case, we're talking about democratic socialism, so I wouldn't go as far as to say it's ultra left-wing compared to totalitarianism. Communism would be the ultra left-wing version of socialism. So, for example, Canada is a semi-socialist state. No one would sit there and call them communists due to the fact of they have political democracy, they have freedom of movement, all the different things you look at when you're determining a country's political ideology. They would be a soft socialist like I'm talking about here. By the way, most of the countries we consider to be communists are actually totalitarian regimes. States like the Soviet Union or communist China or North Korea. They espouse the ideas of socialism, but they work in a political way as a totalitarian regime. By the way, we'll talk about this later on, but there is a difference between socialism and National Socialism. I just brought that up. So, for example, if you look at National Socialism, it pools everything for the betterment of society. Socialism pools everything for the betterment of individual people. So there is a difference there. A lot of people get it confused. They see socialism in National Socialism. By the way, National Socialism, the most famous version of National Socialism is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Some of you may know that as the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party, they are not socialists, not in that particular sense. And we're going to go into that later on in some detail. As I said, though, when we look at socialism, the socialism we're talking that's strictly socialism, we're looking at democratic socialism. And that's where you have a socialist form of government that upholds all civil liberties. Citizens control the government with activities like free and fair elections and competitive political parties. But that they pool resources for the betterment of the people. In the case of Canada, their main socialism is socialized medicine. So that's the definition of socialism. Now, what's capitalism? You hear that thrown around a lot because we live in the United States, and the U.S. is a semi-capitalist society. Notice I said semi-capitalist society. And that's because, obviously, we do have many social programs that do also make us a semi-socialist country as well. And if you don't believe that, then look at Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, on and on and on. Capitalism is a system of government that favors free enterprise, where private businesses can do things without regulation. Obviously, since the United States does have many regulations, it is not fully a capitalist society. I would argue there's no such thing as a fully capitalist society because all countries have some kind of regulation on business to protect the workers. Now, libertarianism. Now, this is the one that's a little more difficult to define because they are in themselves so fluid. The definition, at least, of libertarianism is that it's a political ideology that opposes all government action unless it's to protect life or property. They believe in the absence of government restraint. These people are known as libertarians, and they are, depending on the level of libertarianism, they oppose essentially all government. Now, they're not anarchist, which would like to see the overthrow of society with no government. They do believe government has a small place. They just believe that the government should only be there to protect life and property, and they should stay out of people's lives otherwise. Now, those people who oppose all government in any form, who believe in absolute freedom, these are anarchists. Anarchism is essentially the removal of all government. Whereas libertarians say, well, okay, we have to have a government, but we really don't like it. We're going to oppose everything it stands for, except for protecting life and property. They believe in no government whatsoever. The government should be disbanded. There should be no more type of regulations. Nothing. That there should be no government. We should all just rule ourselves. It sounds good in theory, but again, we have to go back to that problem that all men are not created good, and so that does create one problem with anarchism. By the way, anarchism is probably one of the most violent ones. If you look back at the history of anarchism, more people have been assassinated, more political leaders have been assassinated by anarchists, self-proposed and just self-identified anarchists. At least one or two American presidents were murdered by anarchists. So just keep that in mind, that while it sounds good, hey, we're against all government and we just want people to live in peace, anarchism is in many ways very violent in its means to the end. Now let's look at U.S. political ideologies. And realistically, we only have two major political ideologies here in the United States. We have the conservative movement and the liberal movement. Now, what are the differences? You hear them used all the time. I'm a conservative. I'm a liberal. I'm a Democrat. I'm a Republican. But if you were to ask most people, what does conservative mean? They'll give some canned answer they get off of TV, but they don't actually really understand what a conservative or what a liberal is. And in many ways, we're all conservative and we're all liberal in some way. It's just some people lean a little more to one side than the other. Now, what do conservatives believe? Well, they believe that the original purpose of government was to maintain the social order. And they feel that the power of state should be used to coerce, to force, to maintain that social order. Conservatives usually believe in firm police action, swift and severe punishment, and laws regulating people's behavior, not just crimes, but actual behavior itself. And their goal is to preserve the traditional order. They believe in a more domestic role for women. They believe that the authority of business interests should be firm. And they believe in religious norms. Now, I want to be clear, they do not oppose equality. They just don't want to enforce equality. Now, in comparison, a liberal. Liberals support a more fluid purpose of government. Instead of maintaining the social order, they prefer to promote equality. They believe in the equal treatment and protection of people under the law, and they promote equality as being valuable and necessary for a democracy. Now, what is democracy? We use that term quite a bit, and again, I would argue that most of us don't really know what it actually means. And that's realistically because, first of all, there's a lot of misunderstandings about democracy and the levels of democracy and how much of a democracy is one country versus another. So let's take a look first at ancient Greece. Now, when the philosophers of ancient Greece were coming up with their ideas of government, they came up with three different outlines for what a government should be. The first is called an autocracy. Autocracy comes from the two words autos, meaning self, and kratos, meaning power. So autocracy means self-power. And an autocracy is where the concentration of government power is in the hands of one person. Historically, we call this a constitutional monarchy. Best example in modern history of this would be the Russian Empire prior to the 1917 revolutions. The Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Russia, was an autocrat. He had all the power and used it on a daily basis. The second outline of government is called an oligarchy. And this comes from the words oligos, meaning a few, and archo, meaning to rule or to command. And this is a government where power is in the hands of a very small elite. Historically, this was a country where you had a king or a queen, but most of the power resided in the nobility and the landowners. More recently, it's been either those people who have a lot of money, in the case of the Russian state today, the Republic of Russia, or whatever they're calling it now, it's an oligarchy. The ultra-rich control Russia. And also states that are controlled by the military, states like North Korea. North Korea could fit into the autocracy or oligarchy outline of government if you worded it in a certain way. So any government that the power is controlled by just a few people is an oligarchy. Now, a democracy comes from the words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. This is people power or power of the people. And this is a government where power is in the hands of the common man. The masses rule by rank and file citizens. This started in ancient Greece, in Athens, around the 5th century BC. And this is basically where modern democracy came from. Started out in Athens in the 5th century BC, and it evolved into the modern day United States and European Union. Now, procedural views on democracy. First question is, who should participate in the decision making? How much should each participant's vote count? And how many votes are needed to reach a decision? These are all three very important questions, because the answers to these questions determine whether you are a direct democracy or an indirect democracy. And there are major differences. People will refer to the United States all the time as a democracy. Well, we do have democratic organisms, but we are not a true democracy. We are not a direct democracy. We are an indirect democracy. And that is why people will always say America is not a democracy, it's a republic. And that is a very true statement, because only a direct democracy is a true democracy. Now, what do I mean by that? That only a direct democracy is a true democracy? Well, first of all, a direct democracy is what we call a participatory democracy. This is a system of government where citizens rule themselves. And they do this through universal participation, political equality, and majority rule. So for the example of universal participation, everyone participates in the government decision making. Political equality, one person, one vote, all are counted equal. 3, majority rule, decisions of the group should reflect over half the people participating, aka a simple majority. Over 50% of the people voting is majority rule. Now, an indirect democracy, like the United States, is a representative democracy. Now, how's the differences? Well, first of all, when you look at universal participation, in a direct democracy, everyone participates in the government decision-making by actually going out and voting. Well, this does have universal participation, but it's in a completely different way. Your universal participation is when you go out and vote. You do not vote on normal day-to-day policies. You vote on representatives to then enact policy for you. When it comes to political equality, again, one person, one vote, and all votes are counted equally. For the United States, there's 2 things about that. First of all, again, your vote is only for representatives. In the case of a direct democracy, you're actually voting on the legislation, each person. And second of all, with the Electoral College that we're going to talk about in a few weeks, one could argue that not all votes are actually equal. Each person gets one vote, but some states, your vote counts more than others. A thing about majority rule is that indirect democracies do usually have majority rule. The only thing is, if you look at the United States, our majority rule is for some things, other things need super majorities. This is done to protect minority rights, so that a minority cannot be denied something because of the majority. That is a very important part of democratic principles. But again, if you're looking at democracy itself, where people govern on their behalf, it's a little bit different. And finally, responsiveness. Representatives who are elected public officials to govern on your behalf, they have to respond to public opinion and sentiment. That does not happen in direct democracy because you go out and vote for yourself. So you are not having to hold somebody accountable for how they represented you. And by the way, let's face it, not everyone is represented by their actual representative. If you believe in certain things that are maybe a little more liberal and you live in a county that's very conservative, your representative is probably more likely to discount any opinion you have over the opinion of his majority, which is overwhelmingly probably a little more conservative. So there are pluses and minuses to both. The plus to direct democracy is that you get the say in actual legislation, but the positive for indirect democracy is who has time to vote on every single law when you've got a busy life. And that's why you hire someone to do it for you. But again, you give up that oversight in real time. Another interesting viewpoint is the viewpoint of a majoritarian versus pluralist. If you live in a majoritarian country, this is a government by the majority. So as I said in that previous slide, 50% of the population plus 1, the majority of the people who vote, it's their way. On the other hand, we have what's called a pluralist society, and this is where government decides things through competing interests. Do you know what form the United States falls under? What kind of democracy? Is it a majoritarian democracy or a pluralist democracy? Well, we are actually a pluralist democracy with a hint of majoritarianism. If you look at the way our government is run, certain things are done through majority, but the majority of things that are laws or regulations that are done here in the United States are basically made up of many different competing interests. Everyone is getting their say and then crafting things so it doesn't hurt them as much as someone else. So we are actually both. I'd say more a pluralist society than a majoritarian society. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or send me a message through Canvas Messenger. Have a great day. Goodbye.